Welcome to the Idea Talks, where we discuss big ideas. The Idea Talks is a bi-weekly podcast with Josh Tice and other leaders on big ideas for life, leadership, and ministry. And I'm your co-host, Drew Planencia, and we are glad you're here. For more information on this podcast, visit ideanetwork.church.
Today's big idea is going from the assistant pastor role into the senior pastor role. Yeah, that's a big conversation. And one of our best friends and leaders at the network just did it. We're joined live today by Steve Miller.
Welcome to this edition of the Idea Talks. On today's episode, we have a very special guest slash old-time friend, the Stephen Miller. How you doing, Steve?
I'm doing fantastic. I'm glad to be on the episode.
Yeah,
Hey.
Stephen Miller is the guy who started this podcast.
Yeah, episode 1 through a lot. It's his origin story.
Drew, there is no you.
There's
and
no
there
me.
is no me
Yeah,
without Steve.
yeah.
And that's the
This is
truth.
absolutely correct. I couldn't have said it better myself. No, I'm just it's
awesome.
it's a team effort, and I'm glad that the legacy is living on here with the Idea Talks.
If you go back, and literally, I want you guys to do this. Those of you who are watching now, some of you just discovered the podcast this year. Go back to the first 10 episodes. Now, don't judge the quality of the audio.
Sure.
Definitely judge the quality of the content. It is stellar because it was a
Yes,
Steve and Josh
yes.
show.
Yeah.
It was a lot of fun back then.
Yeah, it was, man.
All right, Steve recently became senior pastor of Heritage Baptist Church in Ashburn, Virginia, with him and his wife, his 2 kids, Marcus and Miles. I remember them from when they attended here and for friends with our kids. Becky has a wonderful podcast called the I Can Relate podcast. You should go check it out as well. She does that very frequently, and
My
a lot
wife
of people,
loves that podcast.
a lot of people have been blessed by it. So, Steve, thanks again for being on the podcast today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me, guys. I'm excited to talk about this topic of transition and becoming a senior pastor. Something very fresh in my life, and so I feel like God has really taught me a lot of things through that transition time.
Yeah, I'm excited about it. You talked about it at the summit that we just had. But, that's such a limited audience, and the podcast reaches so many more. There's a lot of guys sitting there, your friends, my friends, or people that don't know us yet personally, but, they're part of our clan, they're part of our group, they're part of our network, and they're sitting there, and they're right there, right? They're 32 years old, they're 28 years old, maybe they're 24 years old, maybe they're 42 years old, and they're thinking to themselves, okay, I feel like God is calling in the next step, but I don't want to screw this up. I want to honor God. I want to honor my pastor. I want to honor my family. I also want not to have to eat soup for the next 3 years. Like, there's so many things that are going through their mind, but there's this strong calling to the senior pastor role. You went through that process, Steve. What would we say to these guys?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot to process in a transition like that. For me, I've come to the realization, and I think a lot of guys come to the realization that transition is a part of ministry. It really is. Very rarely does a guy, graduate from seminary or college and, keep the same ministry job and position his entire ministry career. And especially early on in ministry, a guy graduates, he gets on staff, he learns, he develops, he moves on. And so it's not a matter of if I'm going to transition, what should I do? A lot of times it's a matter of when I transition, what should I do? And that's important to keep in mind is that transition is going to happen. And especially a very common transition is the assistant pastor to senior pastor role. That is in church world, that is kind of a transition that either a lot of guys make or a lot of guys consider making. And there's honestly, there's a right and wrong way to do that once you decide that God's calling you to be a senior pastor. And at the summit, we talked through that and just kind of gave a step-by-step guideline to this transition and how to be wise about it. Every situation is different, so we can't say this step-by-step guideline applies and will work for every situation. But I think it's it's at least a good framework to keep in mind when you're considering transition for sure.
Yeah, I love it. You talked about the good ways and the bad ways. I think it'd be a little fun just to talk about in general, not specific people, I'm sure, but in general, there are stereotypes of bad ways in which this takes place. What are some of those that might come to mind? Bad ways in which transition can take place. I mean, obviously, there are those that you never want to be in a place where you're leaving behind all enemies. And I think we have a tendency within the Christian world to idolize and then vilify. Somebody coming in, this person is the greatest thing that ever was, and they're going to be absolutely the savior of our church, our youth ministry, our adult program, our small groups, whatever. And we idolize far beyond the ability of this person to perform. And then when someone goes away, we do exactly the opposite. We vilify them. Well, let me tell you what was really going on. And I think so much of that is so inappropriate, especially in the Christian world. But I think it's really, I don't know, I think it's really common. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of guys, when they're looking to transition, they get in their minds something and they convince themselves that this is the right way to do it. And many times, especially in the Christian world, we spiritualize bad decisions. And so we say, well, God is calling me to be a lead pastor. So instead of going and talking to my pastor, I just went and found a church, and then that church, voted on me. I accepted the call. And then I told my pastor I was leaving. How in the world could he be mad at that when I'm following God's call for my life and not understanding his perspective and not understanding what it means to lead a church and to try to, manage a staff and all these different things, and not giving respect to the guy who's basically, made sure you had a paycheck and made sure you had life insurance and made sure you had health insurance and all these different things and took care of you. So I think a lot of times the reason why we do it is because we just kind of add God to the top of the bad decision, and It all works out and everyone's gracious. And so that's where I think that having a step-by-step guideline will help us to avoid saying, yeah, it was a pretty bad decision, but it was for the Lord, and so you can't be mad at me. And I think, there's a lot of grace given. So, we kind of talked about this. And again, the idea with this is I'll share a little bit of my transition, and I'll infuse that for sure. And again, the idea is not that this works for everybody, because everyone's situation is different. But when you're considering a transition, I would say, number one, you have to evaluate your situation. And a couple of questions you have to ask yourself is, question number one is, are you leaving or are you going? There's a big difference. If I am feeling that God is calling me to be a lead pastor, then that means I'm probably going. I'm going to go to another ministry. But if I'm in a situation at my current position where I'm frustrated, I'm upset with the team, I don't like the culture, I don't like that I'm not getting paid what I think I'm valued, and then I start looking to try to find a lead pastor position, now I'm not going somewhere, I'm just trying to leave where I'm at. Wow. And there's a big difference. And so I think the answer to that question will determine whether or not you should even continue this process. Because if you're just trying to get away from the frustrations and you're looking for freedom, the freedom that you'll get being a senior pastor will not eliminate the frustrations of ministry. And so you've got to be honest with yourself about that. Matter of fact, I wrote a blog about that on the Idea Day Network blog, and I shared those thoughts about, are you leaving or are you going? That's a good question you have to ask yourself. There was a time, honestly, in my life where I was frustrated with just some different things in the ministry that I was in, and I began to look and say, okay, where can I find a place that I could go and lead? And here's the thing, the church that you're going to, if you're leaving a ministry, the church that you're going to is not looking for someone who's trying to get away from frustrations. They're looking for someone who's spiritually healthy. They're looking for someone who's thriving. They're looking for someone who's developing and growing. And you're doing a disservice to the ministry or the church that you're going to go lead simply because you're looking at it as a way out from where you are. So I would say, ask yourself the question, are you leaving or are you going? The second question I would ask myself, or I would ask in evaluating your situation is, are you prepared to lead? I think a lot of times assistant pastors think, I want to be a senior pastor because I want to preach on Sunday. And so that's what I want to do. And there's so much more to being a senior pastor than preaching on Sunday. And you have to ask yourself, are you prepared to lead a church and an organization? Are you prepared to be the owner, the leader, to take the risk, to be accountable for the decisions that you're going to make? And I remember a little quick story here. So I was looking to find a church to pastor, and this pastor called me, and he said, "Hey, I noticed that you were looking for a church to pastor." And he said, I'm looking to transition out, and I was considering you. And I said, "Oh man, it's great." And I looked at the situation. It looked like a pretty good situation. It was a small church, a young church, just getting started. And he said to me, "Now I'm looking at you, and I'm looking at somebody else." And now, and this is what he said to me. He said, "Now, the other person I'm looking at," he said, "really doesn't have really great speaking ability, and I'm not sure if he'll be able to attract new people to the church." He said, "But man, he's got like a heart like David. He's just like humble and he knows that he's not really good. And I think God can really use him." He said, and he literally said, he says, "Now you, man," he goes, "I know you could speak, and I know you can lead." He's like, and I thought to myself, man, and I told my wife that conversation afterwards. I said, "Man, I guess, Becky, if I just sucked a little bit more, then maybe God would call me to be a pastor." And I think we get this in our mind that, okay, I'm ready to be a lead pastor because I'm so bad and I lack so much ability that if God uses me, then man, he'll get all the glory. And so that's why I'm ready. And I began to study actually the life of David. And I thought, well, David was a ferocious leader. David was skilled. He had great ability, and he was just looking for opportunity. And so it really encouraged me, because I kind of got discouraged after that conversation. And so it encouraged me to say, okay, you know what? If God is calling me to be a lead pastor, it's not just about, can I preach a message every Sunday? Is, can I lead? And can I lead a church to the next level? In the situation that I was in, the church asked me to come and present to them for 90 minutes. 45 minutes was my vision for the church. And then 45 minutes was them questioning my vision about the church. And in that moment, they didn't ask me, can you preach well? They never asked me that. They wanted to know if I could lead. And like right now in our church, we're going through major building renovations right now, hundreds of thousands of dollars renovations. We are hiring contractors. We are, moving the church forward. We're seeing God push us in a lot of great ways. We're seeing growth. All of that requires leadership. No homiletics class can teach me that. And so I would just say, as you evaluate your situation, don't just say, well, I like to preach, so I should go find a place to preach every Sunday. I would say you have to ask yourself, are you ready to lead and take the risk that being the lead pastor requires? And if you're not, that's okay. Stay where you are and ask God to help you and grow you and develop you. But if you are, you're like, yeah, I'm leaving, or I'm going, I'm in a healthy place and I'm ready to lead, then I think you should consider, continuing this process.
I love the distinction, because, some might argue, well, I'm preaching, isn't that leading our church? And it's so much more than that. To your point, sure, there's a lot of leading that is taking place when you're up in the pulpit on Sunday morning for 45 minutes or however long you preach. But there's also the other 164 hours a week that isn't inside the church building that you have a job to do, and that's to lead the flock of God. So I like the distinction.
I love it. Brilliantly stated.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's what we talked about, evaluate your situation.
Okay, so somebody is sitting there and they're thinking to themselves, all right, I need to evaluate my situation. I think I might be ready based on what you just said. I think I'm not trying to be prideful. I'm not trying to be arrogant, but I'm kind of like you, Steve. I look in the mirror and spend time with the Lord, and I think, yeah, okay, my wife, my dear friends around me, my mentors, whatever, they think I'm ready. Let's do this thing. I've evaluated. Now what do they do?
Yeah, absolutely. So once you evaluate it and you feel like, this is a step that I'm ready to take, or at least I need to consider, the second thing would be to approach your pastor. And I'm assuming that in most contexts and situations, you're working at a church, you're an assistant pastor on a staff, you're connected to a ministry where you have a boss. So the very next thing you need to do is approach your pastor. And here's a key shift in approaching your pastor. You need to express to your pastor your desire, not your decision. And it's important to have that distinction. Many times guys will say, okay, I've thought about it, I've prayed about it, I feel like I'm ready to go. And now I've made the decision. I'm going to be a lead pastor. Let me go tell my pastor that. And so they walk in the office and they say, hey, pastor, I know you thought I was going to be here for 5 years or 10 years. I know you were trying to build a staff around me, and you had visions of a team. But I want you to know that after 5 years of working here, I've made a decision that I'm going to go be a senior pastor. To me, that's where you've just put your pastor in a corner. You've backed him in a corner, and you've made him feel like he wasn't important enough to be a part of the process. And so that's where you have to express to him, even if you feel very confident, yes, this is what God wants me to do. I would go to him and express to him the desire, not the decision. So that's exactly what I did. I went and talked to my senior pastor at the time, Pastor Scott Toole. And I said to him, I want to talk to you. I said, I feel like God might be calling me to be a lead pastor. And I'm not sure if that's exactly what he wants. I'm not sure if that's the final decision, but I wanted to let you know this is how I was feeling. And I would ask you to pray with me. And so what we did was we approached him with a desire, and then we agreed upon a time of prayer and processing, which was very, very important, because now he's not having to process the decision I'm making. He's processing the desire that I might make a decision. And that just helps him now to be able to walk with me in this journey. And so we did. We agreed. I said, Pastor, could we pray about this for 2 months? And then in 2 months, I'll come back to you and we'll meet again. And I'll let you know what God is doing in my heart. And so we agreed upon that. We prayed about it for a couple of months. And then I went back to him and I shared my decision. And I told him, yes, I do feel that God is calling me to be a lead pastor. And because he had time to process that, he affirmed that with me. And he said, yes, I feel the same thing. And we were walking together. The other key, though, in that when you approach your pastor is once you approach him with a decision, you also need to be intentional about the direction of that decision. Because just saying, I feel like God wants him to be a pastor, okay, what does that mean? Does that mean start a church? Does that mean take over a church? Does that mean you're going to become a pastor in 5 years? You've got to be intentional about that. So when I came back to him, I said, Pastor, I feel like God's calling me to be a lead pastor. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to find a church to pastor. And I would like for you to give me 8 months to look to find a church. And then after those 8 months, if I've not found a church, then I will commit to staying here another 12 months and not leave, just so that you don't have to worry about when I'm going to stay and when I'm going to go. And he was thrilled with that, right? And it's important. You say, why would we do that? Like, why so much intentionality? Because it's intentionality that's going to help him to process, and it's going to help build that relationship. I think about Joseph. When Joseph was brought from the prison to interpret Pharaoh's dream, and he interprets Pharaoh's dream, right? And he says to Pharaoh, this is what it means. It's going to be 7 years of famine, 7 years of plenty. And then at the end, it's interesting where Joseph says, now, Pharaoh, what I think you should do is I think you should find a guy who's really wise, and you should put him over the entire operation so he can make sure that it's all taken care of. What was Joseph doing in that moment? He was being intentional about the direction. And so a lot of times what we do is we say, okay, Pastor, I'm going to be a lead pastor, and I'll let you know kind of what happens over the next couple of months, and I'll keep in the loop. No, don't do that. Be intentional about the direction. And then once you express yeah, go ahead.
Well, I just want to jump in because I wanted to validate that. No, I completely agree, Steve. The problem and the result of not being intentional with setting the direction is that you're telling the senior pastor, I don't know what to do, so will you please set the direction? And if you do that, that is so dangerous for you. Because immediately, if somebody comes in and says to me, I've been doing this now for a while, if one of my teammates came in and said, hey, I've decided I'm going to be a senior pastor, I don't really have a timetable or plan on that. Just want to let you know. Immediately, because I'm a decisive, I'm the leader. I've got to decide. I'm like, okay, fantastic. I figured out a timetable. We'll see it. You know, you've got about 3 weeks left. But coming in, number one, saying I want to be part of the process not only makes it spiritually safe, it also makes it practically safe for you, because now we can walk through this process together. I can help guide you, or at least feel like part of the process, as you've stated. And then when you're coming to me and presenting several options or a direction, I'm like, yeah, that could work. Otherwise, I'm immediately thrown and I'm thinking to myself, okay, I'll make a decision. And I'm thinking about the health. I want you to do well, but my primary responsibility is the health of this organization, which means I've got to replace, I've got to get rid of. When is this going to happen? I've got to move now. And so what you're doing is not only spiritually safe, it's practically safe for your children and for your livelihood.
Absolutely. You've got to be intentional. I can't tell you the number of guys I've talked to that are going through this, and the one thing that they lack is clear intentionality about what they want and how they want to transition. And it's important that you walk into that with your pastor being very intentional. But I would also say, on the flip side of that, as intentional as you might be and as intentional as you want to be, you also need to be fully prepared to defer to his plan. Because as the pastor, he still needs to pastor the church. He still needs to move forward, and God's called him there. So you may walk in with a plan, and he may say, no, you know what? I think if you were out of here in 3 weeks, that would work best for me. You see, that's important to understand as well, because the pastor, the senior pastor, has to lead and has to continue to move forward. So when I walked into my senior pastor's office to tell him my decision, I was fully prepared that whatever he said he needed to happen, I would do, right? And so that's important as well, to be fully prepared to defer to his plan. And you say, well, that's not fair. You know, if my pastor told me I had to leave in 3 weeks, I don't know what I would do. Here's the thing. It's interesting. It seems like only in a ministry job can we go to the boss and tell him that we don't want to work for him. We want to work somewhere else, but we need the current boss to keep paying us and providing for us while we try to walk away from the job he's given to us for the last several years.
We were literally just talking about this in a deacons meeting, but yeah, I can't agree more.
Yeah, and that pastor, that's a great point. Then that pastor has to go to a board or a deacon board and say, hey, okay, so just so you know, I'm going to give you an update on what's going on with the staff and with the team. And the deacons who or the board who work in the world are going to be like, what? We're doing what? We're going to pay this guy what for how long to do what so that he can figure out what? It makes no sense. And so you've got to realize your pastor is not the only person thinking through this. He has to lead all of his big time leaders through this process too. And you're in the corner as kind of wondering, like, I don't know, eventually the Holy Spirit might touch me 3 months from now about a specific area, and I'll point on a map. Whoa, there's a lot of people that are thinking through this decision with you.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember going to my pastor and telling him there was a church that I was looking at, possibly being the lead pastor. And I said to him, these words, I said, Pastor, I want to go consider this church, and I'm wondering, should I get a one-way ticket or a round-trip ticket? I didn't know if he was going to, he could have said, you're fired. You could have said you're done. Now he didn't. And many times we complain about our leadership, but not realizing the graciousness in which they are keeping us employed. It'd be like, if you worked at Costco and you're like, hey, I work at Costco, and you go to your boss and say, hey, I think I'm going to go check out Sam's Club, but I'm not exactly sure when they're going to hire me. So I need you to keep paying me until I can leave you to go to a competitor. Right? In the world, we'd be like, that's crazy. You can just leave now. But I'm thankful for the graciousness of godly leaders who are willing to help young assistant pastors process that. And I don't think all the time assistant pastors realize the position they put their senior pastor in when they do that. So that's why it's important to be really intentional.
Fantastic. Well stated. So somebody saying, okay, I've processed my situation. I've looked about it. I've evaluated. I think I know where I am. I think I know what's next. I'm being very intentional with my senior pastor. Where do they go from there?
Yeah. So the third step would be, after you evaluate your situation, approach your pastor, is to prepare for your future. So now you've got to begin to look for a church or begin to plant a church, whatever the direction is. We'll take it from the standpoint of my situation, which was I was looking for a church that was already established. And so the question is, okay, how do I find a church to pastor? You know, and there's a lot of different practical things that you can do to do that, to find a church to pastor. I will say that there's a lot of churches that need pastors. It was interesting to me to note that I know there's, you know, obviously I believe in church planting, and I actually thought about planting a church for a while, but I saw that there was a need for young men like myself to take a church and to help, revitalize it or grow it and those type of things. So that's the direction that the Lord led me. So you can be very intentional in this step. I would say you have to realize that there's certain things that you're going to be a good fit for, and there's certain churches you're not going to be a good fit for. When I got the okay from my pastor, I literally went nuts and I started applying to every church that needed a pastor. I mean, I would come home and I would tell my wife, I would say, "Hey, Becky, I put my resume in a church in Florida, Washington State, and Oklahoma. So process that," right? And she really helped me. She really calmed me down. And she goes, okay. She's like, she would say, well, I don't want to live there. And I'm not sure about that place. And where is that town at? And then I finally realized, okay, what I need to do is I need to be intentional. And so Becky and I sat down and we made a list. What would be a church that we would consider pastoring? And the list for us was very simple. We wanted to be in or near a large city. We wanted to be around lots of people. We wanted the church to be smaller. We wanted to grow with church. One of the beautiful things in my ministry life that I was able to be part of was growing with Southern Hills. When I came on staff, we were running about 400 people, and very quickly we grew in that time. And not only did the church grow, but we as a staff grew up real fast, trying to lead this church. And so we really cherished the fact that we were able to grow with the church. And so we were like, well, let's look at a smaller church. And so we looked at that. And then we wanted a church that was, established, that could take care of us, provide for us financially. And we wanted to be close to professional sports teams. That was one selfish one that I told the Lord. And hey, that's what I wanted, right?
No, that's fantastic.
So,
but, I have a buddy down in Southern Cal. His name is Steve. He planted a church. And when you ask him, why did you decide to go down near San Diego to plant a church? He would tell you, well, I wanted to go surfing. He says, I love surfing.
Absolutely.
And I love that. It is one of the most amazing, simple, great, fantastic spiritual answers. He could preach the gospel anywhere, and it's okay to include some of those things in your list. So I'm really thankful that you said that. Keep going. Sorry about that.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a great idea.
Especially
Draw nigh to God and hopefully give you the
for
desires of your heart, right?
Yeah. Absolutely. Yes. Especially because you're not only going to pastor that place, but you're going to live there. So where do you want to live? That was a big thing for me. I love where we live. We wanted to be in the DMV area, the DC, Virginia, Maryland area. And so when a church came up in Iowa, nothing wrong with Iowa. I think Iowa's a great place, but I didn't look at it and it didn't make the top of my list as a church that came up in the DC area. And so it helped me to narrow down what I was looking for first. There's other places you can look to. You can look on job boards. There's actually, Christian like church job boards you can look at, Slingshot Group and church staffing. That's actually where I found the church that I pastor now, was on churchstaffing.com. And I was able to go through that process. I will say this too, as you look for a church, just keep in mind the process is long. When a church is looking for a pastor, most of the time they're not in a hurry because they want to get it right, because they're wanting to find God's man for a long period of time. So they're going to be slower to bring on. Also, too, I would say when you're looking for a church, look for the potential of the church, not the package of the church. And that's important too. The potential. Is this a church that can grow? Is this a church where there's enough people to reach? Is this a church that, has the right spirit and has land in a building? Look at all of those things, because that's going to determine the future potential of the church. A lot of times, sometimes if you're not careful, an assistant pastor will say, wow, I'm going to go take this church because they're going to pay me 25% more than where I'm making now. Don't look at the package. Look at the potential. I think that's important. And then also, I would say that when you're looking for a church, look for a church that is willing to walk you through a process, not just offer you a position. And that's important because a lot of times, as when you're looking for a church, you can find a church that will say to you, yeah, come and be our pastor. But I think you would do yourself well as you look to become a senior pastor to walk through a process with the church, because a process gives clarity about you to the church so that they know exactly what they're getting. And for me, that's what happened. So when I found Heritage, they advertise on churchstaffing.com. I put my resume in and they reached out to me, and I went through a pretty rigorous process over the next 3 or 4 months. Then it included 2 video interviews, a 12-page questionnaire, a 90-minute presentation of my vision and questions about that, a candidate weekend. And then after all of that, they finally voted to see if they wanted me to be their pastor. And I appreciated that process so much because I was able to share with them exactly who I was. They knew what they were getting. Matter of fact, even there was a point in the process where I looked at them and said, I may not be the right guy for you, because we were walking through vision and changes and forward-thinking vision. And I told them, I said, if you bring me on as your pastor, we will make changes. We will move forward. We will make decisions. And if you're not ready for that, that's okay. But just so you know, because I would rather be rejected for who I am than accepted for who I'm not. And that's an important thing. And so you need to look for a church, and you need to just begin to walk through a process so that you can find the right church for you. At Heritage, they had 117 applicants for the senior pastor position, and they, over about a 3-month process, they narrowed it down to 3 and then finally to 1. And then on August the 23rd, I was unanimously voted as the pastor. And so I think you have to prepare for the future. Another thing I would say is, this is kind of a side note, maybe it's not a side note, but another thing I would say is, when you begin to prepare for the future, many times what I find is that a lot of guys who are in ministry have never actually been through a professional interview process for one reason or another. Like, they got hired on because they grew up at the church, or their dad was the pastor, and they just kind of brought on. And so a lot of guys go into the senior pastor process very unprepared. They have a resume that doesn't look good, that doesn't represent themselves well. They don't know how to write a cover letter. They don't know how to present themselves in an interview. And so I would say, as a way to prepare for your future, you need to make sure that you have a professional resume, a professional cover letter. You need to make sure that you're prepared with a doctrinal statement, and all of these things need to be designed well and professional. And in this day and age, there is no reason to not have a professional looking resume and cover letter. There are services that you can hire, and it's every dollar to do that, to make sure that you're representing yourself well in that process. Because a lot of times, the only way that a church can evaluate you is based upon the piece of paper called your resume that you give to them. And if that's not sharp and professional, then you're going to get passed over, and you need to give yourself the best opportunity possible. So that's important as well.
Man, I absolutely love it. Everything that you've said is so practical and helpful. I know it was a help to the people that listened to the session at the summit just a few months ago. But for those who are just getting this content right now, maybe you're a bivocational guy and you're somewhere in the Midwest or in the South, and you're like, you know what, I feel like God wants me to take a step forward in a different direction. Follow the step-by-step process that has been given here. And again, maybe you're sitting there and you're like, now that I'm listening to this, I am that bivo guy, or I am that assistant pastor. Maybe I'm not. I don't want that right now. I hope that this lesson itself, I hope that this episode has helped bring some clarity. Maybe if it's not, I just want to throw this out. Steve, is it possible to throw out your social media handles? Maybe somebody can @ you, maybe somebody can contact you, and maybe ask a few personal questions if they're really deep in that process right now, or they're thinking through that. Would that be possible?
Absolutely. Yeah. So you can find me on Twitter and Instagram. It's at Pastor Steve 82. And just hit me up there. On Facebook, you can find me. Just search for Steve Miller. There's a lot of Steve Millers on Facebook, so I think it's like SteveMiller.988 is actually what it is. So you can find me there as well. And I will say to that, Josh, that's a good point. I just want to say, Let me just say that speak to that point, Josh, that you just brought up. I became a senior pastor when I was 37 years old, and I had been in ministry. I had been in ministry for 15 years. And some people may say, well, why didn't you become a senior pastor earlier? One of the big reasons why is because I just valued the security that I had as an assistant pastor more than I valued the opportunity that a senior pastor would have given to me. And that was okay for me. I was very happy with being a senior pastor, with working hard, fulfilling my roles, getting a paycheck, not worrying about who's leaving the church, not worrying about if the offering's up or down, not worrying about any of those pressures that come with the senior pastor role. And I was very happy for a very long time. And so if you're getting further into your ministry career and you feel like, I feel this pressure that I need to transition to be a senior pastor, but I really enjoy where I'm at, don't give into that pressure. Just realize that if you value that security at that level, that's okay. And it was okay for me to do that. Eventually, God will make it clear when it's time to take that step. And when he does, you'll have an outline and some guidelines that might help you during that process.
I love it, Steve. I think it's incredibly helpful, not only for those that are listening that might be in that position, but even as a senior pastor, I'm looking at this saying, this is a great conversation that I need to be having with my team. I want them to hear this if the Lord so calls. One of the things I want to invite you to do, Steve, and I didn't do this prior, but I'd love you to come back, not necessarily on the podcast for the same subject, but using this subject in our weekly virtual roundtable conversation that we have via Zoom for the Idea Network members. Would you be willing to do that?
Absolutely. I'd love to do that.
Okay. So for those of you who are just finding out about membership, you've been listening to the podcast, you probably already know about it, but you can become now an official member of the Idea Network. In doing so, there's a lot of content that's provided to you, the resource library, so that any kind of document you need for your church is right there and available to you. There's specialized events that Idea Network is going to be hosting just for members only across the country every single year, as well as the weekly. My favorite aspect is the weekly roundtable conversation. Idea Day doesn't have to be once a year. Idea Day can be every day or every week with you on Tuesday. And virtually we get together and we have one specific topic brought to you by a leader like Pastor Stephen Miller on a very specific subject like transitioning to the senior pastor role. And you're able to take that opportunity and give, if you have a membership, that link to anyone within your organization to allow them to be a part of that conversation. We don't have the exact date. Pretty soon we'll release, let you know when that week will be. But that access is available to you if you become an Idea Network member. All you have to do is go to the ideanetwork.church and register for membership. Even now, we'd love to have you be a part of the official membership of the Idea Network. Thanks, Steve, so much for being a part of this today.
Oh, it's been great. I've really enjoyed it. It's great to be on the podcast that I've been on a couple of times as the host, and I'm so thankful for what God is doing using the Idea Day Network. So many relationships are being built, pastors are being encouraged, leaders are finding friends, and that's what it's all about. And so I'm thankful to be a part of it. I told my wife, I said, when God calls me to be a senior pastor, I said, my group, my tribe will be the Idea Day Network. And so I'm thankful to be a part of it and to be able to contribute it in some small way.
Man, huge. I mean, literally, we joked about it at the beginning, but Drew, there is no Idea Day without Steve Miller. He is the guy behind the original creation of, and there is no Idea Talk. So if you're listening to this podcast right now, just say a prayer to the Lord and God bless Steve Miller, because we love him. Seriously, bro, thanks for hanging out with us today. Looking forward to seeing you again real soon.
If you would like to reach out to us, drop us an email at joshtice@ideanetwork.church. If you benefited from this podcast, we ask that you take a moment to show your support by subscribing, rating, and reviewing the podcast on iTunes. Thanks again for joining us, and we will see you right here again at the Idea Talks podcast.